If you're anything like me, you're probably a little bit obsessed with the Second World War, and you have been since you were quite young. Maybe you even thought of yourself as being a fighter pilot, and you have exactly the right aircraft picked out. But did you ever think about the aircraft you probably wouldn't want to fly if you were in that situation? If you were to go online right now, you'd probably find a list of the 10 worst World War II fighters, and they would be pretty much the same 10 on a dozen different websites. But if you look really carefully at those aircraft, some of them should actually be on the list of the best World War II fighters. But let's face it, no one sets out to build a bad aircraft. So what we're going to do in this series of videos is to discuss that together and choose the definitive list of the worst World War II fighters. When you hear the phrase wooden wonder, your mind probably conjures up an image of the de Havilland Mosquito. You probably wouldn't think of the Lavochkin, Gorbunov, Gudkov Lag 3. This was one of the most common Soviet fighters during the early years of the Great Patriotic War, and was made largely of a wooden construction material called Delta wood. Like the Mosquito, the Lag 3 was designed to be mostly constructed from this plasticized plywood because of the strain of sourcing aircraft-grade aluminium in the Soviet Union at the end of the 1930s. Ironically, for a near-all wooden fighter, the Lag 3 was extremely heavy, which wasn't helped by its underpowered power plant. Despite having impressive armament in early versions, the Lag 3 was not popular among its pilots. The fighter was unforgiving in the hands of a novice and didn't react well to sharp turns, as well as having poor stall and spin characteristics. One saving grace was the fact that the Delta wood material didn't catch fire very easily, though the laminated wood did have a habit of shattering when hit with high explosive rounds. Not the best material for your wings. It's reported by the end of the war, pilots were calling the Lag 3 Guaranteed Varnished Coffin, a play on the design's name in Russian. However, the design team behind the Lag 3 never stopped working on it. In the numerous series the aircraft went through, it was finally produced to the standards it should have been in 1941. The power plant was improved, the airframe was lightened, and the armament was swapped out for something less heavy. Despite this success, the enemy the Lag 3 had to face had also been hard at work. This ultimately meant that the Lag 3 was more effective against bombers than German fighters. Although many pilots would have loved to see the back of the Lag 3, others found great success on the fighter, but its long-term legacy was the ultimate Soviet fighter it gave life to. Falling out of favour with Stalin, Semyon Lavochkin was forced to work in fairly basic surroundings to improve the Lag 3 without official approval. By experimenting with the Shvetsov ASH-82 radial engine in a Lag 3 airframe, he effectively gave life to the Lavochkin LA-5, which was to be one of the most outstanding Soviet fighters of the war. So, should we keep the Lag 3 on the list? Another wooden aircraft that tried to make an impact on fighter development was the French design Caudron C714, which could arguably be called the wooden disappointment. The C714, like the Supermarine Spitfire, had its roots in the world of aerial racing. A direct descendant of the Caudron 750 and 760, which took the world circuits by storm in the 1930s, the C714 was an attempt to militarize that success. The principle was simple. While others were building aircraft predominantly out of metal, Caudron constructed theirs from wood. This meant that they didn't need the powerful but heavier power plants to propel their racing planes to victory. The Caudron C714 was envisioned as a cheap and easy to build fighter which could help plug a gap in the arsenal of l'Armée de l'Air. The French Air Force, like that of Britain, was largely caught off guard with the swift development of the Luftwaffe and was desperately in need of aircraft even as late as May 1940. However, even the C714 could not be built fast enough to fill the French escadrille, and even if it had been made quickly enough, they wouldn't have wanted it anyway. It was also not very pilot friendly, having a relatively high landing speed. In addition to the slow manufacture of the aircraft, which was carried out by Renault on behalf of Caudron, the finished aircraft was a victim of poor workmanship. The airframe was also severely underpowered, despite being made of wood, and had very poor climb characteristics. Ultimately, the biggest failing was in the very streamlined racing design itself. It was impossible to install a better engine in the aircraft without having to totally redesign it. Unlike other fighters of the day such as the Spitfire or the 109, the Caudron C714 was not going to change to keep up with the times. Despite all these failings, Caudron received a rather large order in November 1939 from the French government of an initial 20 airframes, with an option for 180 more following this. The aircraft didn't make it into operational squadrons until January of 1940 and was soon recognised as an inadequate replacement for operational aircraft then in service. The order was cancelled in February, and the French began palming the C-714 off on others, in particular to the Finns, who were sent 6, and the Polish, who were operating as part of the Polish Army of the West within l'Armée de l'Air. The Poles cannot have been best pleased with their new mounts. Within days of receiving their new aircraft, the Ministry for Air made an announcement that effectively grounded the C-714. It was viewed that badly amongst the French High Command. With the Germans then smashing across France, the Poles had no suitable alternative to the C-714, and so ignored the order and fought on in the beautiful but inadequate Caudrons. Although they suffered rather heavy losses, they also achieved several victories over the Luftwaffe with the C-714s. Upon the armistice between France and Germany, most of the Poles abandoned their Caudrons and joined the Free Polish units gathering in England. Perhaps the most telling indictment of the C-714 as a fighter comes from the Finns. Desperate for fighter aircraft during the Winter War and later continuation war with the Soviet Union, the Finnish Air Force would operate a wide variety of aircraft, often those deemed undesirable by other nations. Of the 6 C-714s that made it to Finland, not one was operated as a fighter. Even the Finns weren't that desperate. So, should we just leave the Caudron C-714 on our list and move on? I think so. If you're enjoying the debate so far, why not help support the channel by liking the video so it can spread to more people. You can also help me produce these videos by heading over to calibanrising.com/support, where there's lots of ways that you can get involved and help the channel out. The Curtis-Wright CW-21 Demon was one of those aircraft that had extraordinary capabilities, but ultimately had a disastrous operational career. It certainly was a fighter with huge potential that was never fully exploited. Designed primarily by Curtis-Wright as a lucrative project to export to the foreign aircraft market, the CW-21 owes its creation to the war between China and Japan. From 1937, American observers of the conflict realized that there was a need for an incredibly light fighter with impressive climbing characteristics to meet incoming Japanese raids. Based on the earlier training aircraft, the CW-19, the CW-21 was a modern and aerodynamically designed airframe which was certainly up to the original intended task, quickly getting to altitude to intercept bombers. The aircraft was made to be incredibly light and was certainly a no-thrills design, lacking both self-sealing fuel tanks and armour, though this was actually more common than one might think in the aircraft being built around 1939. Its climb rate wasn't. The most accurate estimation of the CW-21's climb rate is probably about 4,800 feet per minute. Just to put that in context, the best fighter the British could offer up, the Spitfire, could only manage about 2,500 feet a minute. The 109E would comfortably climb at about 2,990 feet a minute. And amazingly, the jet-powered fighter Me-262, which took its maiden jet flight just 4 years after the Demon's own first flight in 1938, could only manage 3,900 feet per minute. Of course, this isn't an apples-to-apples comparison. The Demon certainly had wings. As the CW-21 had been specifically designed to meet a need of the Chinese Air Force, it wasn't surprising that this is exactly where it was showcased for purchase. In testing with a Russian-built I-15 and I-16, the Demon test pilot was easily able to get on each one's tail by exploiting this impressive rate of climb. Impressed, the Chinese ordered 3 complete CW-21 airframes, in addition to the prototype being displayed, and parts for a further 27 to be built in China. However, this is pretty much where the story of the CW-21 ended for the Chinese. The 3 completed airframes that were shipped to Asia were caught up in Burma due to political issues with Britain and Japan following the fall of France. Feeling exposed by a potential Japanese war, and with Indo-Chinese ports being blocked off by Vichy France, Britain was not going to jeopardise the delicate peace by allowing warplanes to be sent to China through Burma. Eventually, these 3 Demons, built by Curtis, found their way into the hands of the American volunteer group instead. However, they never saw real active service, and 2 were lost due to mechanical issues resulting in 1 pilot's death. Of the parts sent to China, little is known other than they did arrive in the country. Nevertheless, China was not the only foreign nation to purchase the CW21 Demon. The Netherlands made an order for 24 airframes, which after the fall of the country in 1940 found their way to the Dutch East Indies instead. Designated the CW21B, the aircraft sent to the Dutch boasted a newly designed undercarriage and hydraulically operated flaps. The B was heavier than the original, but was actually faster by some 18 miles per hour, despite losing some of its impressive climb rate. This put the top speed at a little over 300 miles an hour. Its armament was also different. Instead of the twin 50 or 30 caliber configuration in the CW21, the CW21Bs flown by the Dutch used 4.303 machine guns. Originally this should have been 450 or 30 caliber machine guns, but the Dutch would have to use what they could get their hands on. Despite the improvements made to the original design, the CW21Bs still lacked adequate protection for the pilot and fuel tanks. This fact would actually put them on par with the Japanese aircraft they would soon face. In the chaos that followed the entry of Japan into what the West would call the Second World War, the CW21Bs operated by the Dutch were decimated. You could argue that this wasn't completely due to the aircraft's deficiencies in design, but rather through the overwhelming force and lack of time for its pilots to learn to exploit its abilities. Unable to effectively dogfight with the Ki-43 Oscars and Mitsubishi Zeros operated by the Japanese, the CW21 did have a better roll rate than either and could certainly outclimb them. Instead of avoiding fighters by using this latter capability, the Dutch were often forced into deadly engagements with superior numbers, which left the CW21 force in ruins. So does the Demon really deserve to be on our list of the worst fighters of World War II? Being light, as well as lightly armoured, didn't stop the Japanese Zero from being the apex predator of the Pacific for most of 1941 and 1942. Perhaps it was the CW21's modest armament. Not boasting cannons like the Zero probably wasn't such a big issue for the Demon, seeing that the enemy it actually met in the skies had equally light armour as itself. Perhaps if pilots had been able to take a breath and actually figure out how to use the aircraft to its fullest potential, as they did with the P-40 and even P-36 over Burma, the CW21 might have been on the list of the best fighters of World War II. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. If you made it this far, then please do like the video to help it spread to more people, and tell me in the comments what you think about the list of the aircraft today. Should they be on a list of the worst World War II fighters? And also, what aircraft should we talk about in our next video?